Hi, welcome to the XY Chromies Confidently Uncertain, a show where two Army vets turned renewable energy engineers talk geopolitics, veteran issues, science, engineering, and everything in between. I'm your host, Pearson Guest, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, Richard Ellis. How's it going today, Richard?
Guten Tag, Pearson. Wie geht es Ihnen?
Sprachen Sie Deutsch? I don't. Nein. Meines Sohn ist
Nein,
sehr
get that shit out of
klug.
here.
All right. Well, I
Yeah.
guess it is
Good day. Good
appropriate.
to see you.
Good to see you too. We're on episode 37, and
Woo!
yeah, that's pretty crazy. We've been doing this for not even a year yet, though, so I guess it's not that crazy. We'll revisit it in the summer when we've hit a full 56 of these things. Yeah, so I wanted to start off today's episode with a fun little story I heard recently by one of our favorite historians, Casagranda, Dr. Casagranda, over in, I think he's in University of Austin. Is that where he's at? Do you know?
Or at least
Yeah.
that's where the videos that we're watching. Those are the videos, the contemporary videos that we can see of him are coming from University of Austin.
Okay. Yeah. So, and he was lecturing there in 2023. So, so far, those are the latest videos I've seen so far. And I know that he was lecturing in 2022 because the story has historical relevance in today's times. So I'm third party relaying this story, but I thought it's worth interest. It's really interesting. So this is about Poland and how the Polish government was almost hijacked by potentially the Russians, but definitely by the far right. Now, good news, unlike other governments closer to home, maybe, and elsewhere, theirs is not under the influence of the Russians or the far right now. But gosh damn, it was close. And so here it is. The story starts off as in the 90s, a Polish American author who his parents were from Poland. They had fled there during Soviet era Russia, I believe. Have you heard this story? Have you heard this one yet? I want to know right off the bat if I'm
I
retreading
don't
ground
think I
for
know the
you.
specifics of it. So
Okay.
so so continue. I mean, I know a lot of the loose facts around the 1990s and what was going on in Central and Eastern Europe. But go
Okay.
ahead,
So
spool it out.
he's writing a book in America in the 90s, but his parents had fled Soviet era in a while before that. His mom she was a freedom fighter in Poland during World War II. She was fighting the Nazis. Um, and she was rescuing Polish Jewish people at the same time because they were being persecuted by the Nazis. If you didn't know, Nazis successfully killed more Polish Jewish people than really any other group of people. And generally, the Poles lost like 5 or 6 million people during this conflict, not from fighting. This is just like being massacred and being ethnically cleansed by both the Germans and the Russians. So both. In fact, they had an agreement. We've talked about it, I think, during World War II loosely. So she was around in Poland during these periods of times, and she was a badass. She's fighting the Nazis, obviously. She's a badass. She rescues this Polish Jewish guy and falls in love with him. They become freedom fighters together. He dies. Then she is heartbroken, rescues another guy, ends up marrying him. The author that I'm talking about, that's his parents. So he has a Polish Catholic mother and a Polish Jewish father. And one of the famous massacres that happened in Poland, I forget the place, but it's got a name, was where the local population of the Polish Catholics had helped the Nazis round up the Polish community before the Nazis had ever gotten there. This is a pretty famous story. People have probably heard about it in Poland, where if you've ever heard Poland just handed their Jewish population over to the Nazis, this is the story they're talking about. Is essentially the locals rounded up their own population of Jewish people and allowed them to be massacred by the Nazis. I'm guessing my partner Richard is, if you guys don't have a camera, he's looks like he's furiously Googling. Have you come upon anything?
I realize that I'm stuck at the word massacre.
Ah,
Um,
yeah.
no, the search terms aren't just that though. The search terms are because there's so many different ways to approach this, and I was trying to get there fast, but it wasn't coming to me.
I would
Um,
try Poland gives the Nazis their Jewish population. Try that and see if something significant pops. But I'll continue. So, uh, this guy writes this book in 2000. In the 90s, he starts it, but it gets published in 2000. And it's called Neighbors. And he decides he should write this book because Poland uh, needs to address what it did during World War II. Both the good and the bad, right? He's talking about his mom and these freedom fighters and these Polish Catholic people who were saving Jewish folks. And then he uses that to display the dichotomy between the other Polish Catholics who had willingly sacrificed their Jewish neighbors to the Nazis. And he writes this book because he thinks, it's the way you heal is that you account for these things. Now, fast forward to these two brothers. Their name is Kaczynski, I believe. Lesh and something with an N. These guys in the early 2000s decide to form a party like the Law and Reform Party or the Law and Justice Party, something like that. And they're a far they identify as a center right party, a liberal party, which, in case Americans aren't aware, that typically some of these liberal democratic parties are usually center right, because a liberal party is not a leftist party, as some people think. A liberal party is a center right party. That moderate Democrats, moderate Republicans, those might sound more familiar to the American population here, but in other places, liberal Democratic Party is center right. These guys identify as center right and immediately take a far right hook right off the bat. They are big into, they're not big into the Jewish population. Again, they're pretty anti that and some other things that are familiar to, I don't know, the Nazi party and stuff like that. Anyways, these guys form a party and they end up winning enough seats in their government to form a coalition government in 2007. And they do this by gathering. It collapses and then they reform it over a 2-year span with even more far right parties. This goes on for about 2 years. Their government's fairly corrupt. I mean, if you name your party the party of law and order and justice, that, of course, that's going to be the party of crimes. um, are you still Googling, Richard?
Uh, so I have the Wikipedia article up here because that's just going to be the right place to go to kind of like get the right language to do these searches. But essentially, when we talk about the atrocities that were committed in Poland, they start with the invasion and they continue until the day that the concentration camps were liberated.
Yeah.
And um, the 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 things that we found out about the circumstances of Germany's invasion, Poland's crumbling under the invasion, and then their complicity in the concentration camps had a lot to do with the this this larger movement that had been that had just been percolating kind of under the surface for decades and centuries, where the Jewish population that lived in Europe had more or less just kind of lived parallel to other Christian Europeans, but was never really integrated. And it just, depending on who was in charge, they were either utilized as members of the financial class or mercantile class, or pogromed. They were attacked and assaulted and ethnically cleansed. And so the distinction between what happened in Poland in the 1940s and everything that had come before it was industrialization, mechanization, and the specific mindset that came with Hitler's ideology.
Yeah. And that's European industrialization. We should be
Yes.
specific for our viewers too, because as I'm reminded
Mm-hmm.
recently with my historical lessons I've been following, the Middle East industrialized far before the Europeans did. Um, we do like
Turns out
we do like
there's a
to
lot of
re
erasure of what happened.
yeah, yeah. Specifically, I was learning a lot about the Germans erasing a lot of history in the 1500s. They were
Mm-hmm.
trying to do some rewriting of history. Learning about the Byzantine Empire recently, really not ever being a thing. It was
Yep.
just the Roman Empire, and we called it the Byzantine Empire. But that's a different, anyways, that's a different story. So fast forward to where we're at. These
Yep.
Polish brothers in 2007, they're far right. They win. Their government's corrupt, and in 2 years they're voted out. They're in like 2009. That's not the end of their story, though. While they were when they were in power, they were interviewed and they were like, wait, what caused you to form your party and why, to run the government and so on and so forth. They said, we didn't help the Nazis exterminate Polish Jews. That they were so upset at the book that this one American Polish guy had written that they were like, hey, we didn't do that. But, they were Nazis and Nazis like to revise Nazi history. So if you're a Nazi, a good sign of a Nazi, if you ever want to know, besides them Heil Hitlering, Sig Heiling, in the middle of like a speech or putting,
Mm-hmm.
Nazi symbols in their efficiency type of government agencies that they form. If those aren't obvious symbols of Nazism, another one, this is just for educational purposes, no correlation to anything that's happening right now at all, guys. But if you want to know, people who try to rewrite Nazi history to not include the Nazis so much in it, that's a good sign they're a Nazi. Who is that? That country? You might be a redneck if this, you might be a Nazi if that would be another one of those. You might be a Nazis. Revising Nazi history is a big one. Blaming Churchill on World War II is usually Nazis like to do that. If you ever want to know, if someone's like, actually, I think Churchill was responsible for World War II. If you ever hear that, you're talking to a Nazi or someone who's adjacent or they've been fed some propaganda that they agree with. So, anyways, so these guys basically ran and won the government because of this guy who wrote this book that was asking the Polish people to just address history. Like, hey, we've got good parts of it bad. It wasn't like all of Poland gave up their Jewish population necessarily. There were plenty who were fighting to save Jews, as was evident in this guy's family, right? And so that was an interesting story. Fast forward. So in 2010, first off, Richard, what were you doing in 2010? That's a significant date for me. I would like to ask you what you were up to in 2010. Just keep this story lively.
I I had begun my academic pursuits, and I was probably a college sophomore, give or take a few classes.
Nice, fun time,
And
tough time. Class wise, those are some tough
yeah, good
subjects.
times. I had bought a house the year before, and was not entirely insulated by the global financial crisis that had happened the 2 years before.
Yes. You might have been buying that house because of the global financial crisis had happened 2 years before and able to buy it.
Impacted both ways, both positive and
Both,
negative.
yes. Okay, cool. I, due to the global financial crisis, was just starting my first year in the
Correct.
just starting my first year in the army in September of 2010. Or August or sometime around then, I had left for basic, so I was well on my way. That was my 2010. Um, so yeah,
Yeah.
interesting years for us. So in 2010, I wasn't very privy or paying attention to the news yet. I will be honest. I was a 25-year-old idiot who was signing the next 6 years of his life to the government in the hopes of it fixing my life. And lo and behold, it did have something to do with it. So in 2010, the entire Polish government died. The entire Polish government died. And when I mean the entire Polish government died, you knew this? Well, the president, the head of their Polish bank, the central bank, their top generals, the wife of the president, the whole cabinet, 96 people, basically the entire Polish government, went down in a plane crash between Poland and Russia on a 70-year anniversary, a memoriam of the massacre of that Jewish population by the Poles. Now, after this happened, Poland was wrecked. It was this was devastating. I mean, imagine the plane with Trump and Musk and all these people all just go down at the same time. I mean, the conspiracies, holy crap. Biden would have to watch out, right? So this happens and Poland's reeling. So they can't really figure it out. I think they have some partial governments that are forming and just not working for a couple years. But eventually 2014 or 2015 roll around and guess who wins the election again? These two twin far-right brothers. They crush it. They win landslide style. And they immediately start dismantling democracy. Now, they ran on dismantling democracy. So they were like all about this needs to be undone. They're far right. They're basically Nazis. They're fascists. In more than their hatred of just like Jews and other minorities, they were through and through all about this game. There was an investigation in 2022. The investigation found that Russia was probably involved in this, but the problem was these brothers had erased a lot of evidence that would have helped this report have a lot more teeth in 2022. But it did come out, and it was news that they had probably colluded with these brothers to have the entire Polish family killed. Now, the report, people were like, oh, damn, the report didn't do anything. It didn't find enough. But it did lead to these brothers losing in a landslide in 2023. And they were ousted, thank God. While I was hearing the history of this, since the lecture was in 2022, they were still fucking running it. Anyways. So that is a little fun, interesting story that Casagrande said because during his lectures, he likes to say that we're not just history. A lot of times we're flowing through time. And so it's tough to know that history isn't just happening around us. Like history's happening because of decisions that are being made and people are doing things that are causing and events are happening that are making history happen. It's not just, you can't just be agnostic to history. The flow of time, we're in it. So that's my story. What do you think? Questions?
You can't get in the river without getting wet. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I want to request an edit point here. Can we pause the recording?
Sure. All right. Sorry about that break. We had to take a tactical pause due to technical issues. All right. So how's the signal coming through, Richard? Am I clear and glorious right now, or jumbled?
Uh, I think about as good as we can ask for, given the remarkable circumstances that we're laboring under.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
just want to, if I could pare it back a little bit of what I caught, because for the audience's purposes, I was getting a pretty choppy version of what Pierce was saying. Hopefully the recording is nice and clear as
Yes.
it's presented when you hear it. But um, so the great nation of Poland has been a doormat to Europe for a very long time, and it's had the upper hand as a nation, and it the Polish ran Russia for a while, and sometimes it's been the mud and blood and grease that's been ground under other nations' tank treads.
Well, yeah,
And
many
in
times it's been
that,
not Poland, and then it's been Poland again, right? It's literally disappeared as
yeah,
a country, and then or a region, and then it's come back as Poland again, for whatever variety of reasons. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
right. And so the Polish identity and the Polish national identity is really hard to get rid of. It turns out,
Very
which is
strong.
great. I mean, that's wonderful from a historical perspective. I love a story. I love a history. Pardon me. Now that said, what you just related is the audience version of what a professor who talks about sociology and anthropology and history. I think is all his credentials.
Yeah,
But
he
the
identifies as a
lecturer,
political science lecturer that does
yeah,
history, right? Basically, yeah.
yeah, because everything, the history is context. History is the context for what is happening today, and um, the idea that, well, first of all, there's a reason why you don't get everybody on the same plane if you're going to travel somewhere. If you're if it's all the heads of government,
You don't put
let's
the whole
call
government
that
on
out
there.
as a, yeah, that's a bad call. Now, there may have been perfectly good reasons why it made sense that one time, but it sure didn't work out for them. So there's
Not
that.
that close to Russia either.
Um,
I mean, let's just be real. Hello, with the past and the history, and Russia being Russia.
man,
Need I say more?
and so yeah, the other part of this is that this you have this hegemonic power of Russia that, again, talk about a history. My goodness, I mean, you and I have talked at length in this forum about the advent of Leninist communism. We talked about the forces and factors that led to that. We talked about the first transfer of power under Leninist communism to Joseph Stalin, and we never really got into the rest of the mid-century and what came after Stalin, but that that essentially was a period of time where what the Soviet Union had accomplished, the Russian Empire had never been able to fully get its hands around. And it
Hmm.
was able to do that in the post war because of a couple of really important factors. And um, it would take a multi episode series to really get at all of them. And one of them was, I think I shared with you, the lecture that Dr. Roy Casagrande put up on the internet that he calls the ants who ate the elephant.
Yeah, I haven't
And
got to
so
that one
this
yet.
is the story. Yeah, this is the story of the Nazi German attack on Leningrad, which is now called Volgograd, I believe.
Hmm.
The little bit of Lenin erasure there, but the city's renamed Volgograd now. So the Volga River. And the story is harrowing. If you spend an evening just looking at the map of Volgograd now, there's just the city is a memorial to the battle. They retain as much memory of that as possible.
Now, remind me: is this has when this battle is taking place? Has Stalin emerged from his hiding, and has he now
Yeah.
allowed the generals to start generaling?
Yeah.
Like basically, he's given
Yep.
some autonomy to his generals, and the Russians are starting to fight better, right, at Leningrad. I'm trying to remind myself as well as the audience of what battle this is specifically in time.
Yeah. So the Battle of Stalingrad is among I mean, there's some heavy hitters in World War II history, and Stalingrad
Sure.
is one of them. I mean,
Yeah.
there's if you want a fictionalized version of it to watch in the cinema, Enemy at the Gate is a good recommendation. You get to
Jude
see
Law
that
plays a Russian.
characterization of the there we go. The characterization of Russians being sent into battle with not quite enough tactical equipment, such as, I don't know, rifles and boots and things like that. So they were really unprepared for what Germany brought to their doorstep, but they rallied, and they rallied in this way that was a miracle. It would be hard to call it anything other than a miracle from just how Soviet Russia and the USSR was in paroxysms of terror and pain and suffering from purges and
Well, they
all
were on
these
death's
things that
ground.
communism had wrought on it.
They were also on death's ground, though.
Bingo.
So, as Sarah MC
Bingo.
Payne, to mix her with Casagrande, um,
Yeah.
you can remind our
So yeah.
viewers of the death's ground concept if they forgot. But yeah,
So that's from Sun Tzu. We looked that up last time. And
yes,
and when a continental army puts another continental army or people on death's ground, what that essentially means is you're probably going to die anyway. You might as well go down with a fight.
yes,
And the more distressed the assaulted party is, if they have the wherewithal to fight, the more effective they're going to fight, because what do they have to lose?
yeah. So that this is in modern layman terms, we would say they have zero fucks. Get like at this point, they have zero fucks to give because you're fucked. You're in or FUBAR would have been the parlance of the time in the 1950s,
Yeah.
right? Catch 22 in World War II
Yeah.
was a good example
Yeah.
of kind of a death's ground scenario. These unwinnable scenarios force a party to fight and sometimes win. The what seemed
Yeah.
unwinnable. Yeah.
And so in I was going to say in accordance with, but really the pattern of Adolf Hitler's uh, foreign policy negotiations was such: one, he goes to a neighbor and says, "Hey, let's strike a deal. I want these things." The neighbor
Yeah.
says, "That's wild. I don't want to do these things that you're describing."
Yeah.
And they work on a deal, and
While
I'm
he's
generalizing here, so I'm not
maneuvering.
talking
No.
right. Exactly. They work on a deal, and what he sets up in the deal, he was very good at this one strategy. Turns out he's not a military genius. He was just good at this, the strategy of the inverse betrayal. And so what he would do is design these negotiations with his neighbors, Austria,
Russia.
Czechoslovakia, Russia, and as long as he could work it so that eventually the other party would, quote, betray him,
Mm-hmm.
he had the Wehrmacht sitting on the border. Then he just marches in and does whatever he needs to. And really, really, really wanted to be able to use the Wehrmacht in particular with the partitioning of Czechoslovakia, right? The Anschluss was the other term here, but there was this whole. We're really off the top of Poland, but I'm going to bring it back around.
No, that's
here.
okay.
That is to say that ultimately, what happened is with the Soviet Union and Third Reich Germany, Hitler designed a negotiation with Stalin that he could impose upon Stalin a betrayal
Hmm.
which was the ideal setup for the attack into Russia
Yeah,
territory.
Hitler
And
gaslit other people and gaslit this. It's a gaslighting tactic. Basically, it's like, oh,
yeah,
look,
yeah,
I set up a scenario where they're betraying us. Yes, all by design.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
the victim.
Now,
Yeah, it's a victimhood cap. Yeah. Anyways.
what's important about the story of this is why I'm not a very good history professor. I don't remember dates,
Yeah, dude.
but I
Dates
want to
and
say this is
names.
1940. This is 1940. This is 1942. That this is the era of time that this is happening. Um, I'm sure I've got that wrong, but here we go. So, um, something that's really important for anyone who's even vaguely interested in the outcomes of this conflict is that Germany did not have a secure slash in their own possession supply of petroleum.
Hmm.
They had to import all petroleum. Germany is not sitting on an oil field.
No, but
If they
Ukraine
were,
did.
boy, history would be way different.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, it turns out,
Turns
so it
out.
turns out
Yeah.
that Baku was the location of a to Hitler a reasonable location for a oil field to serve Germany's needs.
Yeah.
Now, what's hilarious to us with our hindsight and our ability to pick apart other people's ideas is that by the time the Germans made it to Baku, this is on the shore of the Caspian Sea. Yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
this is Azerbaijan.
Azerbaijan. Yeah. Near
Modern
Persia.
modern
Yeah.
Azerbaijan, the most eastern extremity of Anatolia, or where Turkey is now. And so they made it there, and they broke even energy wise because the problem with having a guy like Hitler running your nation economy, foreign policy, and your Wehrmacht is that he gets ideas that are only about his megalomania.
Yeah.
And so it seemed like a really good idea if you're going to one set up the Russians to betray you, two invade, and three head towards Moscow. Um, you could look back and say, well, I guess if you kept your eye on the ball, you might have Moscow, and then you could do other things with that.
Yeah.
No, this ding dong, I mean, historical figure, Adolf Hitler, commanded his armed forces to stop heading to Moscow, turn the column, and head for Stalingrad. Joseph Stalin is the leader of the Soviet Republic now. He's the
Yeah.
USSR, the leader of the USSR, and Stalingrad is a city with his name. And if you're Hitler, what you do is you do these side projects, these side quests where you go and attack the city with the guy's name on it that you set up to betray you. Because if you pull it off, the history books are going to be great. It's going to be amazing to talk about how you didn't just vanquish this guy, you killed the city
You
with his name on
erased
it.
him.
That's a big
Yeah.
deal.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
totally.
the symbolism. He needed the symbolism was just as powerful as like the actual
Yeah.
of what he should have been doing. Um, yeah, going to Baku instead of just taking Ukraine for its oil too is hilarious. Did Ukraine have developed oil yet by then? Probably they didn't actually. As I say, yeah, that's probably. I don't know.
I think
I don't know if Ukraine
I,
oil was a thing yet. I'm going to say
I
no.
I want to say because this is a little bit of our history that I don't really know that well. It's my understanding that most petroleum development in the Soviet sphere came along much later in
Yeah,
history.
I think so too.
That
Yeah, I think
so
you're right.
Baku just happened to be one of those places. And if you look at Baku on the map, oh my God, it's right there next to the great nation of Iran.
Yeah.
Where the Persian Empire was historically, and per, Iran can produce a lot of oil. They
Yes,
have the
Iran has a lot of
resource.
oil for sure. And considering my
So
wife is Persian, I'm going to have to use the pronunciation button and say, us Americans, especially us Army vets, like to say Iran. It's Iran. So for
yeah, yeah,
future,
yeah.
yeah,
Iran. There we
I
go.
I used to say
I
Iran too when I met her, and she's like, "It's Iran," and I'm like, "I didn't know." I
Well,
Iraq this, and she'd
um,
be like, "No, it's not
you
the
have
same
to
as Iraq."
behave yourself. You have to
Uh,
behave yourself. You are living in the same
that's what.
confines with her. I bid you to conform. I am going to get it wrong just because I'm an Oregonian,
Totally, totally. I'm
and
just,
no consequences.
um,
No, Iran is the ideal pronunciation, and I just like to reflect on it being the historical national identity of Persia.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, no, it makes sense. So I mean, what's funny is I found out that Hitler would listen to all of his generals during the war room. Like he would listen. He would like he'd be like he would say his idea at the beginning, like, "Hey guys, I want to go for Stalingrad," right? And
Yeah.
I don't know this specifically about this incident that you're talking about where he decided like he's like, I want to go for Moscow, right? And then like in the middle he'd be like, I want to go for Stalingrad. So he probably had a meeting with his generals, and they all most likely, because they were World War One vets and they were German World War One generals, so
Yeah.
they kind of know what they're talking about because they basically were like kicking ass in World War One. They just didn't have the people or the food, but militarily they were still whooping that ass pretty hard in World War One. So these are some really smart seasoned generals all advising him. Hitler would sit there for like 3 hours listening to them after he said his idea. Their idea is like, hey, we should keep our eye on the prize. Moscow's the cat, we go for Moscow.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they all tell their reasons, like, this is why we go for Moscow. We'll deal with Stalingrad later. That's a good idea, Hitler. They probably were like, hey, great idea, Fuhrer.
Yeah.
We can,
Yeah.
but maybe just after this. And he was like, so he would listen to everybody and then go with his original idea. Like every time. This was like, I guess, the Hitler mod. Like he would listen to all the generals. I think he used to listen to them more earlier on in the army, in the war. They had a lot more autonomy and they were listened to. And this happened less and less as things went on. But he probably listened to a lot of people trying to talk him out of going for Stalingrad, is my point.
It was so intoxicating I'm projecting on a man that I don't know, and I'm glad not to have.
Yeah.
It's so intoxicating to Hitler in this time to have the Wehrmacht in on the ground, on the land where he had been saying, this is the living room that we need. We need Lebensraum. We need a place for the German people to exist. And I think that probably packaged into that idea and maybe even explicitly said, also, we don't have the petroleum or the land to feed the enterprise of the German Wehrmacht and Nazi state. We just don't have the. I mean, you mentioned it when you were describing the World War One leadership. Germany ran out of things. They had the wherewithal to make things, but their inputs to make those things had dried up. And
Yeah.
This is a Sarah Payne quote. There were no pets left in Germany after the war.
Yeah.
They were,
And their farm, all
they
their
ate everything.
their agriculture, no one was there farming anymore, so that collapsed on itself, and they couldn't import food, and Austria was screwed. The Austro-Hungarian side of things were screwed. The Ottomans were effed, and so yeah, they didn't have any inputs, and I mean, the Russians being able to do. I think it's funny what you mentioned earlier, the Soviets being able to do what no Russian empire had ever done, right? Been able to do.
Yes.
I think we could boil it down to pretty much one thing of why that happened. It was most of Europe was crippled, and especially Germany, and but really most of Europe was crippled after World War II. There was just nothing left there. Um, and the Russians still had the rail system. And that it was just those two things, right? There was really no one to oppose the Russians for the first time, really, in history. There were no Swedes or Danes or Finns. There were no Germans. Germans had been opposing the Russians for hundreds of years, right? The Slavs and Germans had been fighting for hundreds of years at the end of the day. The Poles, like you said, in the mid the 1500s, they had an empire. They were kicking German and Russian butt for a while, right? They owned Moscow for a while. So like Russia never had this much freedom to become the Soviet Union until after World War II, where the ashes, it's funny. America, the U.S. wasn't the U.S. until after World War II either. That's really, World War II was the defining war that allowed America to become the hegemony, and as well as Russia at the time. Those were the two who were left pretty whole. I mean, Russia less so, which is why they probably came broadly in second, but yeah, they were the two superpowers that were left in decent shape. America was in phenomenal shape after World War II. Like, we had 80% of the entire global capital at the time. We had all the money in the world, essentially. We had 80% of all the money. We had it. So we were like, we could just pay people to become democracies, anyways.
If I could, I want to do a contrast here because I'm, my thesis is getting back to your story about Poland getting hoodwinked, basically, after this situation of the political structure of their country dying in one plane crash and then being taken over.
Yeah.
So
and then pulling from the brink just last year, like pulling back from the precipice of Ukraine, Georgia, Latvia, where Anyways, sorry.
So the United States is a naval empire. It's formatted as a naval empire. All of our activities are expeditionary.
Yeah.
But we have a continental resource. We have the resource of an entire continent, which is to say the energy in fossil fuels and the energy in agriculture, and we have the industrial base of a continental empire. When you look at naval empires like Britain had been, they've got the entire ocean and every place that they can plant a flag around the world, but their home base is not really that. It's not a continental empire at home. So they could do a lot with a little, and they did for a long time. But part of what set up this country to be the global hegemon in opposition to the USSR is that combination of having the last standing deepwater navy, and we really put the manufacturing of ships into overdrive after the Pearl Harbor invasion. So there's this brand new, basically fully stocked navy, and we are in production, and shutting down that production is going to be a problem. So we kept doing it for the most part, and then we have this continent of resources to put into our naval enterprise. Russia and the Soviet Union, it's always tricky for me to make the distinction, because the Soviet Union is this thing of all these, it's a amalgam of all these different nations that the Soviet Russians just said, I think we'll add you to our borders now, and we're going to set your security policy, and you're also going to participate in our political system, our pseudo-economic system within that political system.
Yeah, they're vassal state. We could say they're vassal states that were being exploited for their resources, and their men of fighting age. And they're not great places. The Soviet Union was an abomination of subjugation. That's what it is.
It really there's a very legitimate and rational reason why we oppose the Soviet Union as an idea and an entity, and the reason why they made such a wonderful single enemy. They really did.
Yeah.
And I've gone so far as to say that our civilization fetishized their civilization for those reasons. And it's probably coming back to bite us now because of it.
See, it's tough because when I listen to Sarah MC Payne and Dworkash's recent interviews, the last three, she talks a little bit more about the Russian people and what a sad, like, I mean, basically she might as well says no one hates the Russian people more than Russians themselves. And that goes down to the family member, right? I mean, we're talking about like Peter the Great, somebody they emulate, tortured his only son to death. Like these are family members. There's no loyalty amongst the family. You during the Soviet Union, you would out these people just because, like, oh well, at least it's not you now. They're these are people who are bad to each other, and have been bad to each other throughout all Russia history. It's not like there's a reason why it's a stereotype. It's tough. Like it's funny we fetishize demonizing them because they became our big enemy. But they're not. They are bad. They're a bad group of. They're a bad country. They're bad. They're bad to people. They want to do evil things. It's like saying Nazi Germany was good. They're bad. They want to subjugate people. They hate freedom. They hate minorities. Yeah. Russia hates minorities. They hate gays. Yeah. They hate anything that's not a white Christian family. And by the way, they hate them too because they keep sending all of the young men off to be slaughtered. They hate it so much that even if guys go fight and they turn back, they shoot their own soldiers. That's been a common thing Russians have been doing, not for just this war, not since World War II. They've been doing this for centuries. Russians have been shooting. This has been a policy that's built into the code of a Russian war movement is the meat grinder. It's not, we can look at them fighting all the way back through to Peter the Great. Very brutal to their own soldiers. It's gross.
The most recent count is it's I don't have the exact number, but it's something like it's over 800,000.
Oh, yeah.
The number of service members from the Russian Federation who have gone to Ukraine and died is over 800,000 people.
In 3 years.
In 3 years.
Against a country that's...
losses in World War II. United States military casualties of war in World War II.
1 million. Max? Not even. A couple 100,000. 500,000 on the Japanese side. 250,000 on the German side. Those are my guesses. I have no idea.
Okay, these columns are combat, other, total, wounded, total U.S. casualties. So I had to scroll down. It's a long table.
No, that's okay.
1 million. It's over 1 million people that are casualties.
Yeah.
So, 200,000. It's almost 300,000 died in combat. And then, other people died.
Yeah.
That are US,
not very many in the U.S. because
citizens are otherwise related.
We were fighting over there, so that was why the U.S. barely lost anybody in World War II comparatively to most countries. I mean, Poland, a country that's a fraction of the size of the U.S., lost like 8 million people during World War II, just to give a reference. The Germans lost 11, 15 million of their 40 million people or something crazy like that. The Japanese lost 15 million people over the entire breadth of the conflict, 9 million civilians. Not from Hiroshima, by the way. It's Hiroshima was low on that. We're talking starvation. In World War II, there were combat deaths. There were a lot, probably 10 million to 15 million total combat deaths in World War II. But the 30 other million people who died in World War II or so, if it's 40 to 50 million, these are really high numbers. They were all civilians who died of starvation and plague and bombs and just war. Having
Yeah.
countries, everyone's an orphan or moving from everyone is a refugee during World War II. So people were just dying, moving from one place that was fighting to trying to get to some place that wasn't fighting. And people were being raped and killed the entire time, and they were just dying of starvation and disease as well. Um, so these are all just, yeah. So
And,
800,000 in combat in 3 years is astounding. I mean, these aren't a lot of Russians proper, I'll say. These are a lot of people. These are a lot of people from the periphery, the places that Russia likes to call Russia when they need to pull servicemen and enlist them, but are not really considered Russian. If they were in Moscow, they would be treated as second class citizens. They might be more Asian looking than they look Russian, based on certain areas of Russia as well in their ethnicity. Dagestani, all these other stands around Russia, Uzbekistan, and blah, blah, blah. A lot of these areas get pulled for service members or bribed, with all the money these days has been what has, you know, gotten service, kept the.
I brought that up to make your point that we're talking about the way that historically the people living on the Russian landmass have organized their civilization has really been tough on human tissue. It's been tough on human beings, period.
Yeah.
And when we reflect back on kind of the core of the point here, just when at the completion of World War II, the Soviet army invades Berlin, and it's bad for the Germans. Soviet army is not nice to them. And what essentially is happening from that point forward in history is it's retribution, but in a way that it's more complex than that. But it is a retribution. It's the as God is my witness, we will never be invaded again kind of retribution. That's the feeling here.
Yeah.
So despite how the culture despite how the culture that we call Russians has treated people within their boundaries, what they really can't abide is anyone else coming and doing that. And the
Oh,
Germans had done that. The Germans were cruel to them.
yeah. I mean, it should be the implication of if a people imagine it's the same as if you meet someone who's terrible to their own family. If they're terrible to their own
Yeah.
family, imagine what they feel about you. And like
Yeah, totally.
we all know people like that. If they're willing to do that to their own family, imagine who they'll do. And that's the way you have to think about this. I mean, one thing when you look at Middle Eastern cultures or something, there's at least a code. There's a saying. I think it's like, it's me versus you, except for when my cousin attacks us, then you're my brother. Or my
Yeah.
parents attacked us, then you're my brother, and it's us versus them.
Yeah.
If our cousin attacks us, then it's our family versus them. If someone attacks us, it's our whole family, the cousin. And this goes all the way to the
Right.
tribe, right?
Yep.
Now, one thing that would follow after this also culturally why it breaks down beyond that, because basically it doesn't go beyond the tribe. It can never go to like, hey, a political faction. A lot of times, this has been a lot of the issues with the books that have been written that say like how Arabs underperform in wars or how Arabs haven't won wars or why they don't win wars. A lot of it goes down to this culture. But I would say it's a cultural boon to at least have that family unit and this type of ideology that at least understands that like, and we used to have this in the US too, where it would be like, hey, we're fighting politically with each other. You're a Republican and I'm a Democrat or whatever it would be.
Mm-hmm.
And it could get nasty, but once someone attacks us, the country, like Russia tried to attack us with their election interference the last 15 years or whatever, we would like consolidate and go, oh, it's against an outside threat. And really we've kind of lost that that consolidation that we had. But I'm not sure if the
Hmm.
U.S. necessarily always has it. We do flirt in and out. There's a lot of independence in us. People like this this ignorance that we can go it alone has been so prevalent in our country recently, without understanding where we are in the world and what we even mean for the world now more than ever. Like in after World War One, we had that arrogance of like, well, who cares? America first, like they'll deal with their problems. We don't want to deal with that shit. We didn't even want to go into World War One. That attitude, like we shouldn't have even been there. Why are we? We could say it
Right.
now. It's like, why are we even policing? Russia can do whatever they want. Like, why are we? Why do we care? Like, we hear this now. Hear these same arguments. It's interesting to me
Hmm.
because I'd say even in the 1920s, I could give some grace, I suppose, to some of the politicians who were saying this thing because people were idiots and yeah, they didn't know better because America wasn't the hegemony yet. They were a huge global power player. Um, they made up for a good portion of the economy, but we weren't the global superpower yet. It was still, I mean, the UK, Britain was still the empire. Really, we one of the big empires out there. It was after World War II where America became, we were the global superpower. And so now thinking that if we just recede into ourselves and, hey, world, just deal with your own problems, it's such a funny thought with what you and I know of history. And, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. The people that were in charge of the United States and running our systems and government and economy um, would have been. So if you take the 1920s and you subtract, let's say 60 years, let's do a round number, then that gets you pretty deep into the 19th century.
1860s.
So yeah, so you have people that are running the United States whose entire paradigm, their frame of how they operate, their cultural instructions and language is about a 19th century world. It's about a 19th century world in the age of the robber barons. It's a 19th century world in the age of, there's still a little frontier left in the United States. And so they were, as we always do, we bring the previous century's mindset to the modern day problem and then try to solve modern day problems with the previous century's mindsets.
Well,
And it wasn't until people that were born late in the 19th century, early 20th century began to get in power that began to shift a little, but then we're back to the same problem again because time moved and technology changed and so did civilization and culture.
so
So the
some,
isolationist behavior of the 1920s really matched what people were thinking in the 19th century.
see, what's funny about that is, I guess, well, I mean, not everyone's are students of history, but the way I see it is like trying to solve problems in the early part of a century with solutions from a late part of a century. Automatically, I have logical problems with this when I start to think about a wheel of time. Now, a century is just something we made up, right? We could,
Yeah,
at the end of the day, it's, 100 years. Why does that matter? We could have said a century was 150 years, right? And for whatever reason,
right,
I mean, if we changed the language and we changed what metric we were counting by, these are
sure.
just necessarily arbitrary numbers. But at the end of the day, um, time is something that we as conscious beings have given meaning to, just like money is something we have given meaning to. And just because we've given meaning to it doesn't mean it's any less real or consequential. And the fact that we have centuries, that is the time that gives us a countable segment of time. And when we can start
Hmm.
measuring it, that means that time starts to build a character based on what's happening during that period of time. And if I'm examining a sine wave, there's parts of the sine wave throughout an entire cycle that don't look anything like the rest of the other part of the sine wave necessarily. It's a completely different spot on
Right.
the graph. So it's funny to me to go, well, let's analyze this sine wave. It started over again. We're right here at the beginning of the sine wave, but let's look at the
Mm-hmm.
downturn to analyze the upturn right here. That's a good start. So I don't know if I've done a good job of visualizing this, but or explaining this, but I just find that really fascinating to me, to approach a problem like that when it doesn't even mathematically or sequentially make sense to me, right? Like I would at least want to look at the wheel of time and see if it's landing around the same spoke as it goes around instead of, hey, look, it landed there, but I'm going to look at what's happening up here to analyze down here. It just is, it's interesting to me. So
You're I got to tell you, I received the greatest compliment a middle-aged man can receive the other day.
ooh,
I
someone
was at
said you look
Costco
great.
and I
You're looking
was
great. 30s. You're looking.
not even close.
Oh.
No, the greatest compliment a middle-aged man can receive is the person that was ringing me up said, "Hey, you picked a pretty good time to come into the to Costco because it was 8:29. They close at 8:30."
Nice, perfect.
And I said, "Yeah, I look at my phone, I look at the map on my phone, and it tells me when the most popular times are and when the least popular times for a business. And then I just go during those low popular times, and then it's easy for me to go shopping. It's no problem. I have a lot of social anxiety, so
Yeah,
I need to go when it's few people." And then the dude that was putting the stuff in my shopping cart, he goes, "Dude, you are playing three-dimensional chess." And that is a idea that I want to bring to what you're saying, which is you're playing a you're playing chess and everyone else is playing checkers, man. The things that you're coming up with as a way to analyze and think about the problems of our time, you're implying this much greater amount of thought to it than anyone else around us is. And if you think about it for a while, you can see, and this is not like there's lots of folks who want to tell you that there's conspiracies and there's all this stuff going on. I don't even need all that. That's unnecessary. That's storytelling. The reality is that we still think about our political parties as they existed in the 1970s. We still think about our economics as they existed in the 1950s and
90s.
60s.
Yeah,
We
or
still think
whatever.
about technologies as they existed in the 1990s. We still think of all these things as being, we have moved linear and progression away from them, but they're still the same institutions that are there. And that is incorrect. And the same thing is true about the transition between 18 I'm going to do a century here because I was born in 1977.
Mm-hmm.
From 1877 to 1920, that's a chronology. So if we go back in time
Mm-hmm.
and a person born in 1877 and now they're in their 40s in the 1920s, then the chronology is that the types of things that change technologically in that 47 year period are not unlike what's changed in the same 47 years that I've been on the planet. They're subtle and they reflect um a they don't have a lot of pop, like they're not as like catchy as horses disappearing from the roads and being replaced by cars, but it's every bit as influential. So from a cultural standpoint, if someone from the 1870s, 1880s insists on having a Gilded Age attitude about 1920s, 1930s America, they're going to bring a whole lot of trouble to that modern time where the technology of warfare has changed, the technology of communication and transportation has changed fundamentally, the technology of how we make our garments has changed, where how our food is delivered has changed. And
Yeah.
so that's my when I make that comparison. So you and I are thinking about a game of chess, maybe even three-dimensional chess, as a way of approaching these problems that we're seeing around us. And that is not how the rest of our civilization is viewing the situation. They're really looking at it with the paradigm of their late 20th century minds.
with that, I'd like to pause and restart with another episode because I mean, it's a great place to
Right on.
stop because we're at 104. So, hey, everybody. Sorry we were off for a couple weeks. We have been having technical difficulties. Hopefully, this one makes it to print, I have to say. But thanks for hanging in there, the few of you that exist. We'll try to be more consistent so that more people even know we exist. And yeah, please like and subscribe. Adios, Richard. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you next time, Carter. Auf Wiedersehen.